What could possibly cause a modern airliner to completely lose control just seconds after takeoff? Well, this was a new one even for me, and what led up to it is equally frustrating and enraging. Stay tuned. In a well-run modern airline, oversight is baked into every part of its operations, from the government inspectors who watch maintenance work and ride along in cockpits, to safety departments that aggregate and analyze anonymous reports, and to the pilots who submit them. But what happens when an airline operates in an environment where that kind of oversight is limited or even unavailable? Well, it might end up looking something like Nepal's Saurya Airlines. This is a small domestic airline that began operations back in 2014 with just one single Bombardier CRJ-200 regional jet. They began by operating a very limited route network, shuttling passengers back and forth between the capital, Kathmandu, and the cities of Bharatpur and Biratnagar in the southeastern part of the country. The plan was to then continue to grow, but the company's plans to expand service to 5 other destinations soon fell through, and all other routes were then also terminated. That happened most probably because Saurya Airlines struggled to maintain even basic service on its existing routes, almost from the very beginning, and in 2016 a new Nepalese law came into effect, restricting scheduled passenger operations to airlines who had a minimum of 2 or more airplanes, which would therefore have excluded Saurya. The airline therefore ended up being restricted to charter operations only for about a year before it could raise enough capital to buy 2 more CRJ-200s, after which scheduled flights were allowed to resume. However, financial difficulties still continued, and between the 7th of July and 21st of August of 2018, the airline therefore ceased flying entirely for a while. During that time, they put one of their 3 CRJs back into long-term storage, and as far as we can tell, it is still sitting there at the time of this taping. After having done that, the airline managed to resume operations for 3 more months before shutting down a second time on the 27th of November, again due to lack of funds. They then remained grounded for more than 3 months, but resumed operations once again in March of 2019. But then, of course, in December of that same year, the airline was again forced to stop flights since COVID-19 happened, and service then didn't resume until October of 2020. So as you can see, Saurya were just barely scraping by during these years, but following the pandemic, they actually avoided any similar interruptions, and its executives even publicly considered purchasing more ATR turboprop aircraft to expand its operations, but that never really panned out. And it was unclear where the capital for doing that would have even come from anyway. Now, if you're wondering how an airline like this was able to achieve a level of safety sufficient to avoid losing its air operator certificate, well then you are not alone. But the fact here is sadly that in Nepal, Saurya Airlines didn't really stand out from the crowd when it came to this. In fact, Nepal is one of the most dangerous places to fly in the world today, and it's been an unfortunate reality that a commercial airplane has crashed in Nepal practically every single year for quite a while now. Now, to be fair, Nepal is geographically dominated by the Himalayan mountains, where the weather is often bad and where flying is generally difficult and sometimes dangerous to start with, but environmental factors are not the only reason for this poor safety record. Now instead, a big part of the problem is a serious lack of oversight by Nepal's regulatory authorities, who lack the power and funding to adequately oversee the country's booming aviation industry. You see, Nepal is on the United Nations list of least developed countries, so the economic base to fund government oversight is quite small. But even though that is the case, due to the necessities imposed by its geography, Nepal's aviation industry is significantly more developed than pretty much any other country on that list. This imbalance has contributed to the inability of government regulators to adequately oversee all Nepalese airlines, and at the same time, the aviation industry is absolutely crucial to Nepal's large and growing tourism industry. That is also why, as one of the only countries in the world, Nepal has placed its Civil Aviation Authority, or CAAN, within the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, instead of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transportation. Local newspapers have also been recently reporting on corruption within the CAAN, where many officials have close ties to the tourism industry. And in fact, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, has urged Nepal to split the CAAN, since it's not only the regulator and the owner of the aviation infrastructure in the country, but also the concessionaire, which allows it to directly profit from that infrastructure. But so far, that split hasn't happened. Also, due to this lack of sufficient oversight from the CAAN, all Nepalese airlines have been blacklisted by the European Aviation Safety Agency for many years now, something that was also reaffirmed by an ICAO audit in 2023, which found that Nepal's oversight capability was actually getting worse, not better. So this should give you a picture of the environment that Saurya Airlines was operating in at the time when this accident took place. Before we get to the accident, I just want to highlight just how important oversight is in just about any area, really. That's why it's actually quite strange that we don't apply the same principles to our own internet and browsing habits, and also why I am so happy to have Incogni as today's sponsor. Incogni works as your own personal regulator who monitors the presence of your information on the internet and immediately acts if any shady entities like data brokers attempts to sell it. They will then deploy their digital army on your behalf, tracking down the brokers and demand that your information is removed from their sales. And that should lead to you receiving way less spam, phishing attempts and robocalls. It's super easy to get started. You just sign up, create an account, and Incogni will immediately start protecting you and sending you regular updates on their progress. I couldn't believe just how much of my data that was out there when I started, but it's now getting much better thanks to Incogni. So to get going, scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot to get 60% off their annual plan with the code PILOT. And remember, they will always give you a 30-day money-back guarantee if you're not happy, so you risk nothing by trying. Thank you Incogni for supporting this video. Now, where were we? Yeah. At the center of this story was one of Saurya Airlines' 2 operational CRJ-200s, registered as 9 November Alpha Mike Echo. It had been built in 2003 and was just over 20 years old in March of 2024 when its certificate of airworthiness came up for renewal. Now the renewal checks were all completed on time, but the main landing gear was due for an overhaul that for whatever reason couldn't be completed at that time. And as a result of that, the airline applied for and received an extension, allowing it to continue operations without the landing gear overhaul until the 19th of June 2024. However, as that date came and went, the overhaul was then still not completed. So on the 21st of June, the aircraft was just withdrawn from service. It then remained in short-term storage for over a month until maintenance engineers finally finished removing, overhauling and reinstalling the landing gear on the 22nd of July. But by that point, the aircraft was also due for a C-check, which is a deep maintenance inspection of the entire airplane that occurs every 20 to 24 months. Now, the facility that Saurya Airlines used to perform these C-checks was located in Nepal's second largest city, Pokhara, but the airplane had been parked at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu up until that point. So Saurya applied for a permit from the CAAN to perform a one-time ferry flight to move 9 November Alpha Mike Echo over to Pokhara, which was then granted, providing that the aircraft pass a routine return to service check first, which it also did on the morning of the 24th of July. So far so good. And the ferry flight was then scheduled for later on in that same morning in order to start a C-check as soon as possible and hopefully get the aircraft back into service as soon as possible. Now, before I continue, I want to mention some of the things that makes a ferry flight different from other types of flights like scheduled passenger flights and positioning flights. The term positioning flight refers to any flight whose purpose is to reposition the aircraft to complete a scheduled or chartered flight from a different airport. But by contrast, the purpose of a ferry flight is to reposition the aircraft for either maintenance or storage. And unlike a positioning flight, a ferry flight can be conducted with major mechanical faults on the aircraft, such as with an engine inoperative or with the cabin unpressurized, for example. Also, while both of these types of flights are flown without passengers, off-duty crew members can ride along or deadhead on repositioning flights, but not on ferry flights, which are restricted to essential crew only. In the case of the CRJ-200, essential crew means just a captain and a first officer, and the captain chosen for this flight was a 35-year-old with 6,185 total hours, including over 4,900 hours on the CRJ. As it turns out, he was also Saurya Airlines Director of Operations, so he was personally answerable for many of the airline's day-to-day activities, which is worth keeping in mind. Now, the first officer he was going to fly with on this day was 26 years old and much less experienced. He only had 1,824 total hours on this day, including about 1,600 on the CRJ, and he was described by his colleagues as a very nice guy and really enthusiastic about flying. Records show that while receiving his type rating in Germany back in 2019, he had failed to pass his first simulator check, forcing him to remain in the country for an additional 3 months to undergo remedial training before making another attempt. Saurya Airlines deducted the expense of this extra training from his salary, and he was also left on the hook for room and board, which forced him to take out a loan that he was still repaying at the time of this flight. Now, because of his generally low seniority, the first officer had then also been furloughed without pay during COVID, and even when the airline was back flying again, he wasn't getting many hours, which resulted in less income. The total financial burden on the first officer was therefore quite high, and he had told his friends and colleagues that he was dissatisfied with the airline's compensation and benefits. On top of that, he had also apparently concealed this financial trouble from his parents, which would have only added to the significant background stress that he was now under. Now, another issue worth mentioning here was the quality of the recurrent training that these pilots received from their airline. Records show that this was also a bit questionable, but the final report only alludes to this without providing any real details. What the report does say is that many Saurya Airlines personnel had received so little in-house training that they were generally unaware of the airline's own policies and procedures. And the report also states that the Saurya Airlines training syllabus contained a list of training tasks and estimated training durations that just didn't match with each other, leading investigators to suspect that some training items likely were being rushed or even skipped entirely. Anyway, back at Tribhuvan Airport, the pilots were now preparing for what seems to have been a quite unusual ferry flight. As I mentioned earlier, only essential crew were allowed on this ferry flight, but Saurya Airlines didn't seem to comply with that particular regulation. In fact, not only was a non-essential third pilot added, but so were a large number of maintenance and management staff, including several mechanics, the airline's manager of continuing airworthiness, the maintenance manager, the safety manager, as well as the quality assurance manager. One of those staff members also flouted the rules even further by bringing along his wife and 4-year-old child. So in total, 17 passengers boarded the flight in addition to the required 2 pilots, for a total of 19 people on board. Now, any passenger flight is of course required to have flight attendants on board as well, but because this wasn't officially a passenger flight, no cabin crew were provided, and the occupants were therefore not giving any safety briefing either. Now, the reason why so many people were on board this flight isn't mentioned in the final report or any of the news media either, but it might have been because the maintenance staff were needed in Pokhara to perform the C-check, and it was cheaper to fly them there on the airplane itself than to buy them all tickets on a scheduled flight. But this wasn't the only major violation of basic safety regulations on this flight. Far from it. At the same time as the passengers were boarding, the airline's engineering staff were also loading a large quantity of maintenance supplies and equipment onto the airplane. Now normally cargo loading would be performed by cargo handling personnel at Tribhuvan airport, but in this case the cargo was loaded by the mechanics themselves, even though they were not licensed or even trained to do that. They therefore reportedly filled the cargo compartments to the brim, and when that was full, they started loading equipment and supplies directly into the passenger cabin. Among the items placed on the passenger seats were toolboxes, food and wheel chocks, as well as much worse things, like containers of flammable lubricants and cleaning fluids, hydraulic fluids and even engine oil. Now, none of those items were secured in any way during the loading process, nor did Saurya Airlines have authorization to transport hazardous materials in the first place. And what's even more unfathomable to me is that the pilots were fully aware of all of this, and yet they didn't raise any kind of protest. But I guess, as the director of operations of the whole company was the captain, he was likely complicit in these violations from the start. This all says to me that these kinds of serious violations were likely routine in this airline, to the point that nobody was concerned about the potential consequences at all. And it is worth pointing out that a company culture like this only can develop in an environment where everyone either knows that nobody is watching or that those who are watching just don't care. Given what the final report says about the staffing levels at the CAAN, it's probably true that nobody was watching, because an airline that operates like this will get shut down very quickly by any regulator that's actually paying attention. Anyway, as this was happening, the cockpit voice recording began as the aircraft was powered on. At this point, the first officer was the only person in the cockpit, and the CVR captured him starting to calculate the takeoff V-speeds by himself. Now here I want to talk a little bit about what these speeds are and how they're calculated, because that will soon become crucial. The first V-speed is V1, or decision speed, which is the highest speed at which we can safely still reject a takeoff. But for once, that's not going to be the most relevant speed for this story. The second and more relevant V-speed is VR, or rotation speed, which is the speed at which the pilot flying begins pulling back on his or her yoke in order to lift the nose of the airplane and start getting it airborne. Finally, the third V-speed is V2, which is the takeoff safety speed, or the speed that must be achieved by a height of 35 feet in order to ensure a safe climb in the event of an engine failure after V1. Now, these speeds will differ for each takeoff, so we have to calculate them every single time, according to the weight of the aircraft, the temperature, the runway length, the field elevation, and so on. At some airlines, especially large, highly standardized airlines, all of these variables are known to the dispatchers, who just send the V-speeds to the pilots upon request, though the pilots still obviously have to double-check them. Now, this is often done with the help of digital performance softwares that crunches the numbers for the pilots, but historically and still today in many airlines, especially smaller ones, the V-speeds are calculated manually by referencing a set of tables printed on cards stored in the cockpit or in the performance manuals. Now, to use these V-speed cards, the pilots select the page corresponding to the planned weight and flap setting to determine the base V-speeds, and then uses an associated table to determine the corrections for temperature and elevation. These cards are written using data from the aircraft manufacturer, but crucially for this story, these are usually assembled by the airline. Anyway, to calculate the V-speeds for this flight, the first officer needed to know what their weight was, which was actually quite a tricky question since the passengers hadn't checked in by the normal methods and their baggage also hadn't been weighed. So instead, a rough estimate of about 600 kilos was used to account for this. The weight of the cargo was roughly known, and using standard weights for the passengers and crew, Saurya Airlines dispatchers arrived at a tentative gross weight of 18,137 kilos, including the aircraft's empty weight and the weight of the fuel. And using that number, the first officer then followed the V-speed calculation procedures by using the card for a takeoff weight of 18,500 kilos and the flaps 20 setting. Now, since those cards were provided in 500 kilo intervals, rounding up to the nearest 500 was the normal practice, so that's what the first officer also did. Investigators later used performance data to determine the aircraft's weight algebraically and found that it was probably about 18,300 kilos, plus or minus 200. So the dispatcher's estimate was essentially correct, and so was the first officer's decision to use the 18,500 kilo V-speed card. So if that was the case, and things were then basically done by the book, then what was the issue? Well, what nobody knew was that the book in itself was actually wrong. You see, it turns out that when Saurya Airlines created the V-speed cards, presumably all the way back in 2014, someone just copy-pasted the tables for the 17,500 kilogram takeoff weight over to the 18,500 kilogram card without changing any of the values. And since with more weight, it means that you need more speed, this means that all of the V-speeds indicated on the 18,500 kilogram card were several knots too slow. Somehow, this mistake had then been sitting there for as long as 10 years without ever being discovered, and the report doesn't really go into why that was, but what is obvious is that the airline's failure to notice this was indicative of a lack of quality assurance and safety management, which kind of goes without saying at this point. Personally though, I think that it would have been pretty hard for the pilots to notice that these particular V-speeds were wrong, because we don't normally compare the V-speed cards to each other. Now, if the pilots would have used this particular page and its neighbors often enough to memorize some of the values, well then someone might have eventually noticed it. But because 18,500 kilograms was well below the CRJ's maximum takeoff weight, these lower weight cards probably weren't used that often, and no one, especially not a relatively new first officer, would have thought of questioning them. Also, it's worth adding here that even if some flights did take off using the wrong V-speeds for 18,500 kilos, this wouldn't have had any noticeable effect, because the difference was only a few knots, so it just basically eroded the safety margins without making the takeoff in itself impossible. But sometimes margins are all that we have, as we will soon see. Anyway, without noticing this, the first officer calculated a V1 of 114 knots, VR of 118 knots and a V2 of 125 knots, but the correct values should have been 117, 122 and 127 knots. This means that the correct V-speeds were just 3, 4 and 2 knots higher than the calculated ones, which obviously isn't much, but I'll get into how those knots mattered later. Anyway, at time 10:40 local time, the captain finally boarded the aircraft and asked the first officer what checks he had performed so far. After that, he started talking to other staff members on board about the upcoming sea checks, the destination they were going to, and other topics completely unrelated to the flight. And he did not cross-check the first officer's V-speed calculations, which of course was required by standard operating procedures. Although, in this case, to be fair, a cross-check might not have prevented the error, since the takeoff cards were actually wrong. Meanwhile, passengers continued to arrive, with the last person boarding the aircraft at time 11:02, and immediately after that, the flight crew began starting up the engines. But the left engine didn't start on the first attempt, so the start attempt had to be repeated. Now, the reason for this also isn't stated in the report, but it's not that uncommon for an airplane to suffer something like this after it's been parked for an extended period, and it wouldn't have any impact on what's about to happen anyway. As soon as the engines were running, the captain began taxiing out towards the runway, and while taxiing, the pilots performed some of the standard pre-flight control checks, but they also skipped some others. And that is surprising, since this was the first flight after a long period on the ground, and it is especially in those kind of circumstances where issues with the flight control systems are most common. Anyway, after eventually backtracking to the start of Tribhuvan Airport's runway 02, the flight crew received their takeoff clearance, and at time 11, 10 and 25 seconds, the captain began pushing the thrust levels forward for takeoff. As a reminder, this flight was now taking off with 17 illegal passengers, a cabin full of unsecured equipment including multiple hazardous materials, incomplete control checks despite a long period on the ground, incorrect V-speeds and at least one financially stressed pilot. So many regulations were being violated and so many procedures were not being followed that almost all of the normal safeguards and margins that are normally built into commercial aviation now weren't there. But what ended up turning this reckless flight into a disaster actually wasn't something that was on that list. And to explain why, we need to go back to the topic of those V-speed safety margins. Now, the reason that we define VR, the rotation speed, is to ensure that when we begin rotating, the airplane actually has enough speed or air flowing over its wings to actually achieve safe flight. And that's because speed is a key component of the lift equation. There are a lot of things that go into that, and I won't go over all of it here, but two of the factors that determine lift are airspeed and angle of attack, which is the angle of the chord of the wing relative to the oncoming airflow, or basically the pitch angle minus the flight path angle. In very simplified terms, the relationship between these two parameters means that at a low airspeed, a higher angle of attack is needed to achieve a given amount of lift, assuming that everything else remains constant. That in turn means that if the pilot tries to rotate at a low airspeed, a higher angle of attack will be needed to produce the lift required for the aircraft to climb. Now, below a certain airspeed, the angle of attack required for liftoff would actually be so high that it exceeds the wing's critical angle of attack, which is the point where the airflow separates from the upper wing surface and a stall occurs. And a stall wing generates little to no lift at all, so in that case, the airplane just won't lift off the ground. It would just move across the ground with its nose in the air. Now, most likely the pilot would then lower the nose to allow the plane to build up more speed before continuing the rotation, or a tail strike could also occur. But on this flight, the calculated rotation speed was only 4 knots below the correct rotation speed, which wasn't enough to cause a stall during takeoff by itself, because a healthy safety margin is also built into these calculations. So here, something else came into play. During a typical takeoff on Saurya Airlines CRJ200s, an angle of attack between 6 and 8 degrees was all that was needed for the takeoff. And during normal flight, the stall risk would come at above about 15 degrees angle of attack. But when the plane is very close to the ground, a phenomenon called the ground effect both increases lift and reduces the stall angle of attack. So the risk for a stall would have started to increase around about 10 degrees of angle of attack in that case. But again, this meant that the normal takeoff angle of attack wouldn't put the plane at risk of stalling. And that difference between the normal angle of attack and the stall angle of attack is what I previously referred to as the safety margin. A margin that would be reduced but not completely eliminated by rotating 4 knots too early. But the airspeed at which the pilot rotates isn't the only variable in play here, because how fast the pilot rotates is also hugely important. On basically all transport aircraft, pilots are taught to rotate at a rate of not more than 3 degrees per second and then continue with that rate up to a standard takeoff pitch of around 15 to 18 degrees or so. But if the pilot rotates at a significantly different rate from that, bad things can happen. Now, in a previous video I did about Aero Sucre Flight 157, I talked about the problem with rotating too slowly. But this time I want to talk about the much more severe problems that comes with rotating too fast. The root of it comes from the fact that when a pilot starts rotating by pulling back on his or her yoke, the airplane doesn't just instantaneously start climbing. Instead, a sequence of cascading effects occurs. On a conventional aircraft, the first thing that happens is that the elevators deflect in a nose-up direction at a rate that's more or less proportional to the rate of controlled column movement. And the aerodynamic force on the deflected elevators then rotates the entire airplane around its center of gravity, causing the pitch to increase. This increased pitch initially results in an increase in angle of attack, and it's this increase of angle of attack that increases lift and finally causes the airplane to start climbing. But what I really want to highlight here is that this chain of responses is not instantaneous. And in fact, the flight path is the very last thing to respond to the pitch input. But while the angle of attack response leads the flight path response, during a normal rotation, the angle of attack never gets too high, because the flight path normally responds before the rotation is fully finished. Since the angle of attack is equal to the pitch angle minus the flight path angle, the pilot can rotate to a takeoff pitch of 15 degrees or so without the angle of attack ever getting anywhere near that high, as long as the flight path actually starts angling upwards. But if the pilot rotates very quickly, the angle of attack will reach a higher value before the flight path begins to respond, which in an extreme case could lead to the angle of attack exceeding the critical point, leading to a stall. And for that reason, even if the pilot rotates at the correct airspeed and achieves the correct pitch angle, the plane could still stall if the rotation rate is too fast, at least in theory if it's not geometrically limited. Now, for these reasons, the rotation is something that we work on really heavily during training. It's not uncommon for trainee pilots to struggle a bit with the rotation at first, but with sufficient training, hitting that 3 degrees per second sweet spot will soon become instinctive. Now, this training is normally very effective, as you can see by the fact that hundreds of millions of flights take off normally without ever stalling during rotation. But it seems like Saurya Airlines might have been the exception here. You see, investigators later examined the flight data from both of Saurya Airlines CRJs stretching back 16 months, and they found that takeoffs with rotation rates well above 4 degrees per second were reasonably common. And even worse, they identified 14 takeoffs where the peak rotation rate exceeded 5 degrees per second, which is very high. The two worst incidents occurred on the 11th of January and on the 19th of March 2024 on the accident aircraft 9 November Alpha Mike Echo. During the first takeoff, the peak 1 second rotation rate was 5.8 degrees per second, and in the second takeoff, the peak rate was 5.5 degrees per second. In fact, it was later revealed that the pilot flying during the January incident was the same captain who was now about to fly this ferry flight over to Pokhara. But he wasn't the worst, nor the only offender found in these records, which just shows that this problem with fast rotations was widespread among the Saurya Airlines flight crews at the time. And the final report doesn't explain where this issue came from, but as an instructor myself, I can sort of imagine how this might happen. You see, when new pilots start training, it's very common for them to over-rotate at first, and it's hard to get a proper hang of this in the simulator. So instead, this is something that has to be mastered in the real aircraft by constant exposure and instructor feedback. It's quite tricky to teach this because the rotation technique is heavily dependent on seat of the pants feel. There isn't one single technique that you can apply to every rotation because every rotation is different. So it is possible that Saurya Airlines pilots weren't getting enough training time in the real airplane or feedback from the instructors, given the airline's very small fleet and the difficulties that they had with keeping that fleet in service. The report again doesn't mention this, but it is also possible that Saurya Airlines pilots developed a habit of using a lot of back pressure during rotation because of the CRJ's very aft center of lift, which makes it easy to load the plane with an overly forward center of gravity, especially when the plane is full. If Saurya Airlines was mostly operating full flights with a forward center of gravity near the maximum, a slightly more aggressive rotation technique might have been required to get the nose to start moving. And if that was the case, then subsequently on those rare occasions where pilots flew a lightly loaded flight, this now ingrained technique would have been quite excessive, leading to a handful of severe over-rotation events identified in the flight data. Now, the Flight Operations Manual actually warned of the risk of stalling on takeoff due to over-rotation, so this should have been on the radar of the airline's training department, but for whatever reason, it clearly wasn't. What the report did say about this issue, though, is that this trend was never discovered because the airline lacked sufficient quality control measures, and although on paper they had a safety management system designed to detect and collect this kind of data, this system didn't really exist in real life. There was no clear chain of accountability for safety, no system for reporting safety issues, and no flight data analysis program. Even though the airline had purchased a flight data analysis system, that wasn't being used. Anyway, the point that I want to try to get to here is that unless this issue would have been caught, it was probably inevitable that at some point a Saurya Airlines pilot would eventually over-rotate at just the wrong time. Which brings us to the final part of this story. As the pilots pushed the thrust levers into takeoff thrust, the engines spooled up with a roar and the CRJ started accelerating down the runway. As agreed, the captain was at the controls and the first officer was monitoring the instruments, and at 114 knots he called out V1, followed immediately by rotate at 118 knots. A split second later, at a speed of 120 knots, the captain began to rotate by pulling sharply back on his control column. By coincidence, or perhaps due to the relatively low weight of the aircraft on this flight, this ended up being the single most aggressive rotation ever recorded on Saurya Airlines' fleet. Within 1 second, the elevators deflected from 1.5 to 10 degrees nose up, which caused the airplane to pitch up at a peak 1 second rate of 6.5 degrees per second, more than twice the normal rotation rate. This very rapid rotation caused the pitch angle to exceed 12 degrees within 2 seconds, and because the rotation was initiated at a speed that was also several knots too slow, the angle of attack required to achieve liftoff was now slightly higher, which meant that the flight path took longer to respond. This combination of excessive pitch rate and slow flight path response allowed the angle of attack to increase rapidly to a value above 10 degrees, and although the captain stopped pulling back after only 1 second, the damage was already done, as the angle of attack now approached the stall threshold in the ground effect. On 9 November Alpha Mike Echo, the right wing angle of attack was perpetually slightly higher than on the left wing, so the right wing reached the stall angle of attack about 1 second sooner. This was sufficient to trigger the stick shaker stall warning, which activated first on the right side and then 1 second later on the left. At this point, the aircraft was only a few feet off the ground, and even at such a low altitude, the procedure for preventing a stall is the same. The pilot must firewall the engines and try to pitch forward at least a little bit in order to reduce the angle of attack, but that never happened. The final report doesn't explain why the captain didn't apply the stall prevention procedure, but it is possible that the stall simply happened so quickly and so close to the ground that he was caught off guard and didn't have time to react. Now, the first officer clearly recognized that the captain's rotation rate was way too aggressive, because he now started shouting, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, sir, sir, sir!" But that didn't provide any useful information to the captain. What he actually needed to hear was a firm command to reduce pitch or increase thrust, but I think that the first officer's reaction here was quite understandable. When you're suddenly thrown into danger like this, you don't just say, "Reduce pitch," like a robot. You likely need a few seconds to get past the startle before that kind of thinking kicks in, but unfortunately, these pilots just didn't have that long. As the aircraft now left the ground, it immediately started rolling to the right as the right wing began to stall, soon reaching 25 degrees of bank before the captain wrenched the controls back to the left. As the left wing then also began to stall, this rapid input resulted in a very fast roll that reached 55 degrees before beginning to reverse again. Meanwhile, the aircraft actually continued climbing, with the stick shaker rattling away and the ground proximity warning system making several call-outs in the background. Now, those warnings weren't identified in the report, but I would assume they probably included bank angle at least once. Moments later, at a height of only about 100 feet, whilst rolling rapidly to the right again, the aircraft then fully stalled. Now, the CRJ-200 is fitted with a stick pusher that automatically applies nose down elevator in the event of a stall in order to assist the recovery. They have that because, like all T-tailed aircraft, the CRJ is at risk of losing pitch control if the wash of disrupted air from a stalled wing moves over the elevators, leading to a phenomenon known as deep stall. Now, the stick pusher can, in theory, recover from a stall partially by itself, but in this case, the plane was still so close to the ground that there was likely nothing it could do. The recovery needed to have been initiated as soon as the stick shaker went off in the first place in order to catch the situation before the stall became fully developed. And, like I said, that had not happened. So by the time the stick pusher now activated, it was too late. Right at its peak altitude, the airplane rolled into a right bank of over 94 degrees, slightly beyond the vertical, and now fully stalled, possibly even deep stalled, the aircraft started to fall towards the ground, triggering a GPWS pull up warning. The captain responded by pulling hard back on his controls, overriding the stick pusher in a desperate attempt to avoid impacting the ground, but at this point all of his control inputs were completely meaningless. In the final seconds, the airplane started to roll towards level again, before it finally struck the ground in a 30-degree right bank with a slight nose-up pitch, just 13 seconds after lifting off. The right wingtip impacted the taxiway off the right side of the runway, causing the right wing fuel tank to explode, and the plane then continued forward across the grass in a partially inverted position before colliding with a shipping container, a shed, and a helicopter belonging to Air Dynasty. These objects, by the way, were inside the 140-meter safety area on each side of the runway recommended by ICAO, which unfortunately wasn't being complied with here. Anyway, as the airplane impacted these things, the cockpit became embedded in the shipping container, causing it to break away from the cabin and plunge into a nearby ravine. At the same time, the burning fuselage and wings continued over the ravine and down into a nearby construction site, coming to a rest 21 meters below the runway level. The sheer force of the crash caused severe, probably fatal injuries to everyone in the cabin, but if anyone did survive the initial impact, they would have been unable to escape the subsequent fire. The spilled fuel from the wings resulted in a fire that quickly attacked the damaged passenger cabin, and once it got inside, it was probably accelerated by the flammable cargo that had now spilled all over the floors and the seats. And as a result of this, none of the 16 people seated in the cabin survived this horrible crash. In the cockpit though, the shipping container had blunted the impact somewhat, and there was also less fire at that location, so the conditions were marginally more survivable. But for the two pilots and one supernumerary crew member in there, their survival would now depend on the speed of the rescue team. Unfortunately though, that rescue effort was made more difficult due to several factors, including the steep terrain in this area, which did not comply with the ICAO recommendations and which prevented the fire trucks from getting close to the wreckage. Also, the closest airport emergency entrance to the construction site from below was blocked by construction materials and therefore couldn't be used. So instead, one fire truck stopped at the top of the embankment and sprayed water down towards the cockpit, but no other fire crews helped and no foam or chemicals were being used. The final report blamed these failures on disorganization in the airport firefighting service, as well as the fact that the area that this crash happened in was not included in the airport's emergency response plans. And as a result of that, the first people to actually reach the cockpit were airport ground staff who had been running towards the scene after they had seen the initial explosion. They then managed to drag the captain out of the shattered cockpit and helped him walk up the hill to the first responders, who rushed him off to hospital with serious injuries. But the fire soon overran the rest of the cockpit and none of the other occupants were recovered alive. So in the end, 18 people were killed, with the captain being the only survivor. The investigation commission found that the cause of the accident was the captain's rapid rotation at a lower than optimal airspeed, resulting in a stall during the takeoff. The erroneous V-speed card, the airline's failure to identify and address excessive rotation rates, and gross negligence in the planning and execution of this ferry flight were also cited as contributing factors. And on top of that, the report also cited negligence in the loading of cargo and provisions as a contributing factor, even though the investigation found that the unsecured cargo did not shift during the takeoff. The response of the aircraft to the elevator inputs was found to be normal for the stated center of gravity as read from the flight data recorder. So most likely the report included this chaotic and negligent loading as a contributing factor because it exemplified the real root cause, which was the nearly complete absence of oversight. You see, in order to uphold the expected level of safety, the net of oversight must be both wide and deep. And that means having inspectors observing flights and maintenance work, it means conducting internal safety audits, it means training personnel to allow a safety-first mindset, and it means having accountability for violations. So this crash is actually a perfect example of what can happen when all of those things are absent. So without sweeping change, these conditions will likely persist, which makes it especially troubling that at the time of this video being recorded, Saurya Airlines is now trying to get recertified to resume flights again. Immediately after the accident, the airline voluntarily ceased operations since it now had only one operational aircraft, and also because so many important managers had been killed in the crash, including the manager of continuing airworthiness, the maintenance manager, the safety manager, and the quality assurance manager. Now, according to the airline's own website, 5 of its 10 management level staff were on the plane, of which 4 were killed, and morbidly, they are all still listed as managers on the company's website. Due to this loss of staff and the violations uncovered in the investigation, the CAAN revoked Saurya Airlines' Air Operator Certificate, but if the airline's current plan is successful, they could get it back again. And what do you think of that prospect? It is worth remembering that all Nepalese airlines are blacklisted by EASA, so if you don't want to fly on any airline like this, just check the blacklist, which we will link to in the description below. But if you live in Nepal, or if you want to see Nepal's beautiful scenery or appreciate its cuisine and its cultural heritage, then there are currently few other options. So I really hope that the Nepalese authorities will take this report seriously and improve, because no one will be happier than me if they do. Now, if you want to see my next video before everyone else, possibly even today, then please use this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up for my Patreon crew. I would love to see you on my next hangout. And also remember to check out the special exclusive deal from my sponsor. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.